Somewhere inside a climate-controlled underground vault beneath Vatican City, there is a small collection of documents that cannot be consulted by anyone. Not by scholars, not by cardinals. Not, according to retired archivist Archbishop Sergio Pagano, who referenced this in a published account, even by the most senior researchers granted access to the rest of the archive. These documents simply sit there, sealed, unreachable, in a room that most people who work inside that building will never enter. Now, that in itself might not stop you cold. Archives around the world hold restricted material. Governments do it, universities do it. It is a normal part of institutional life. But here is the part that does not sit quietly once you hear it. The documents that attract the most restrictive conditions, the ones that generate the longest gaps in the publicly searchable catalogs, are not from the medieval period. They are not from the age of the Inquisition, not from the Crusades, not from the centuries when popes wielded armies and excommunications like weapons. The most sensitive material, the material where the access rules grow tightest and the catalog entries grow vaguest, clusters almost entirely around one specific era, the 1800s, the century of the steam engine, the telegraph, the photograph, and the railroad, the century that everyone assumes we know the most about. So the question that will follow us through everything we discuss today is not a simple one, and I want you to hold it in your mind like a stone in your hand. Why would an institution that has been accumulating records for 12 centuries be most protective of the ones from the most documented period in human history? Welcome to Epoch Reset. I am Elliot Carter, and if you have not been here before, this channel exists for one reason: to sit with the historical questions that the standard accounts leave unfinished. The gaps, the silences, the cases where the archive ends just before the interesting part begins. If that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, subscribe right now, because what we are going to move through today is one of the most layered puzzles I have ever spent time with. And before we are done, I am going to tell you about a specific document, a text that keeps surfacing in the private papers and correspondence of 19th century scholars and ecclesiastical officials. A document referred to obliquely, never by a fixed title, always as if the writer is aware that naming it too clearly would be naming something dangerous. Whether that document is real, a fabrication, or something in between is a question I genuinely cannot answer. But the pattern of its appearances is something we need to look at carefully. Stay with me, because the closer we get to it, the stranger the surrounding record becomes. To understand why the 19th century files are where the tension lives inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive, you first need to understand what this institution actually is and what it went through in the decades just before that century began. The archive was formally established in its current location in 1612, when Pope Paul V ordered all church records collected in a single place. Before that, papal documents had traveled with popes, been scattered across palaces and basilicas, been sacked by rival factions multiple times, and in one notorious episode in 1406, Pope Gregory XII reportedly sold off a significant portion of the archive registers simply to raise funds. So from the very beginning, this is an institution that has understood loss, fragmentation, and the vulnerability of the written record. But nothing in the archive's history compares to what happened between 1810 and 1817, and this is crucial context for everything that follows. Napoleon Bonaparte, by the time he became emperor in 1804, had developed an idea that sounds almost reasonable on the surface and reveals itself as something closer to institutional theft the longer you look at it. He wanted Paris to become the central archive of all European civilization. The records of every major power, every court, every religious institution consolidated under French authority. And he had the military muscle to make it happen. In 1809, after occupying Rome and arresting Pope Pius VII, Napoleon issued the order. The entire Vatican archive was to be transferred to Paris. What followed was one of the largest forced relocations of historical documents in recorded history. Over the course of several years, 3,239 crates of papal records were loaded onto wagons, transported across the Alps, and installed at the Hôtel de Soubise, the complex of the National Archives of France. 3,239 crates. That number appears in a scholarly study published in the journal Napoleonica in 2013, and it gives you a sense of the sheer physical scale of what moved. Napoleon fell. The documents were supposed to come back. But here is where the first gap opens up, and it is a gap that the 19th century archive has never fully closed. The French government allocated funds for the return that were, according to multiple accounts of the period, grossly insufficient. Vatican officials, desperate to recover what they could, were forced to make impossible decisions. Some volumes were sold. Some bundles of parchment were sold by weight, used essentially as packing material, purchased by a French grocer according to one account that circulated among scholars at the time. Documents were delivered to wrong locations. A sea shipment experienced water damage when bilge water soaked through crates during transit to the port of Civitavecchia. When all the convoys had finished arriving, the last of them reaching Rome in December of 1817, the scholarly estimate, cited in the Napoleonic study and referenced in the Catholic Culture Library's review of Vatican archival history, was that roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of everything that had left Rome never came back. Gone. Not destroyed in a fire or a flood. Gone through a combination of financial crisis, bureaucratic chaos, and decisions made under pressure that no one fully documented at the time. Now sit with that for a moment, because this is where the 19th century problem actually begins. The archive that Pope Leo XIII opened to scholars in 1881 was not the archive that Paul V had assembled in 1612. It was that archive minus somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of its holdings, reorganized under conditions of chaos that, according to historian Owen Chadwick, as cited in the Catholic Culture Review, meant the archive had barely recovered its pre-Napoleonic order even by 1883 or 1890. So when researchers began arriving in the 1880s excited to work with these newly accessible materials, what they were actually navigating was a collection that had been partially lost, imperfectly reorganized, and cataloged in ways that reflected as much the scramble to restore order as the original logic of the institution. And into that already complicated landscape, the Vatican was simultaneously generating vast new quantities of documents. Because the 19th century was not a quiet era for the Church, it was arguably one of the most turbulent periods in the institution's modern history. What do you make of that gap? 1/4 to 1/3 of the archive, missing not from some ancient sack of Rome, but from a transaction that happened in living memory of the people who were later asked to catalog what remained. Does that strike you as the kind of loss that simply happens, or does it open questions? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know how you read that particular piece of the record. 2. The 1800s were a century of catastrophic pressure on the Catholic Church as an institution, and understanding that pressure is essential to understanding why the documents from this period are treated the way they are. In 1870, the armies of a unified Italy marched into Rome. The Papal States, the territories that had given the papacy its temporal political power for centuries, ceased to exist. Pope Pius IX withdrew behind the walls of the Vatican and declared himself a prisoner, a posture that his successors maintained until the Lateran Treaty of 1929. That political humiliation alone would have generated enormous quantities of sensitive correspondence. But the Church in the 19th century was dealing with pressures that went far beyond Italian politics. It was watching the Industrial Revolution transform the societies it ministered to faster than any institution could comfortably adapt. It was confronting new scientific frameworks that challenged its theological positions. It was managing missionary networks that stretched across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, receiving reports from bishops and apostolic delegates in territories that were themselves being drastically remapped by colonial expansion. And it was doing all of this while simultaneously managing its own internal theological debates, which in 1870 produced the Declaration of Papal Infallibility at the First Vatican Council, one of the most controversial doctrinal moves the Church had made in centuries. All of that activity, all of that correspondence, all of those reports moving between Rome and bishops on 6 continents was being filed. The archive from 1810 to the end of the pontificate of Pius XII in 1958 was supposed to follow the practice established in 1924, where the Pope grants access to documents by pontificate. Currently, according to the Vatican News website, the chronological limit for public consultation sits at the end of Pius XII's pontificate in October of 1958. But here is the practical layer underneath that official framework, the layer that researchers who have actually tried to work with the 19th century material consistently describe when they write about their experience. The catalog itself becomes the obstacle. This is the mechanism that deserves its own careful examination because it is not dramatic in the way that locked doors and armed guards are dramatic. It works through a far quieter kind of friction. To request a document from the Vatican Apostolic Archive, a qualified scholar must know what they are asking for. Not approximately, not by subject area, by specific registration number or folder designation. The indexes, as the History Channel's archival overview notes, are not publicly available and are only accessible to scholars once they have completed an approved application process. Which means that to find out what is in a file, you need access to a catalog. And to use the catalog, you need to already be inside the system. This is not unique to the Vatican. Many major archives operate on similar principles of restricted finding aids. But what researchers working with 19th century papal material have noted in academic publications, including discussions in the journal Church History, is that the catalog entries for certain clusters of 19th century correspondence are notably thinner than the surrounding material. Not absent, thin. Entries that list a folder by date range and originating office, but provide none of the subject indexing that would allow a researcher to know whether what sits inside is relevant to their work. And there is something else that the record suggests, something that requires more nuance than a simple accusation of deletion. When the archive underwent its reorganization after the Napoleonic return, and when subsequent prefects worked through the 19th century to impose order on the growing collection, they made decisions about how to classify, register, and label documents that were not always consistent with how those documents had originally been filed. Some scholars working in the archive in the decades after Leo XIII opened it in 1881 found references in one folder that pointed to a second folder, which when requested turned out to carry a different classification number than the citation suggested. Some references pointed to material that, as far as the catalog was concerned, simply did not exist under any of the suggested designations. This might be entirely explained by the chaos of the Napoleonic disruption and the imperfect reorganization that followed it. That explanation is possible, even plausible. What is harder to dismiss is the observation that this phenomenon clusters, as more than one researcher has noted in published accounts, disproportionately around certain categories of 19th century correspondence, not around administrative records or financial ledgers. Around letters. Specifically, the kind of letters that moved between Rome and the bishops and apostolic delegates working in territories far from Europe. Now that hooks into something I want to look at carefully, because the category of communication between Rome and its representatives in the field during the 19th century is exactly where the most unusual reports were arriving. And I mean unusual in a way that goes beyond ecclesiastical politics. 3. The 19th century Catholic missionary network was one of the most extensive information-gathering systems on the planet. By the middle of the 1800s, the Church had bishops, apostolic delegates, and missionary representatives operating in virtually every corner of the globe that European ships could reach, and many that they could barely reach. These were not simply spiritual administrators. They were correspondents. They sent back to Rome detailed accounts of everything they encountered, the peoples they were converting, the territories they were mapping, the existing religious and social structures they were working within or around, and the physical environments of places that most educated Europeans had never seen and could not have located on a map with confidence. Rome received these reports through the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, the Congregazione de Propaganda Fide, which had its own archives separate from but connected to the Central Vatican collection. And the volume of material flowing through that system in the 1800s was staggering. Here is the layer that I find myself returning to, and I want to be careful about how I frame it, because the evidence is indirect, filtered through references and citations rather than through first-hand examination of the primary sources. Among researchers who have worked in both the Vatican Apostolic Archive and the Propaganda-Fide Archive, there is a recognized category of 19th century missionary report that deals with physical findings in the field. Buildings, structures, artifacts, human remains associated with cultures and technologies that the missionaries encountering them could not readily explain within the frameworks they had been trained in. Some of these reports made it into published missionary literature of the period. The journals and periodicals published by missionary orders throughout the 1800s are full of remarkable observations about ruins, objects, and practices encountered in Africa, in Central and South America, in Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. These published accounts were often carefully filtered, phrased in ways that subordinated the unusual finding to the broader narrative of missionary purpose. The underlying reports, the raw correspondence, the letters sent back to Rome before any editorial processing, are a different category of document entirely. What some researchers suggest, and I want to be clear that this sits at the boundary of what the available record can confirm, is that the gap between the published missionary literature of the 19th century and the underlying correspondence archived at Propaganda Fide and the Vatican is wider than the gap you would expect from simple editorial compression. The argument is not that Rome was suppressing reports of ancient wonders for sensational reasons. The argument is more institutional and more interesting than that. The Church in the 19th century was engaged in an intensely contested public argument with the emerging scientific establishment about the age of the earth, the antiquity of human civilization, and the timeline described in Scripture. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. Charles Lyell had been systematically arguing for the immense age of geological formations since the 1830s. The dating of human artifacts was becoming a serious scholarly discipline. And the Church, particularly under Pius IX, who reigned from 1846 to 1878, was publicly and forcefully resistant to frameworks that challenged the scriptural account of creation and human history. Into this context, imagine a bishop's letter arriving in Rome from a territory in West Africa, or from the interior of South America, or from an island in the Pacific describing structural remains or physical objects that a trained 19th century observer would have assigned an age wildly inconsistent with the accepted human timeline. What happens to that letter? The standard answer is that it gets filed, that it becomes one of thousands of documents describing unusual things encountered in the mission field. That Rome, busy with its own political crises, does not assign it any particular significance. That is a reasonable answer. It is possibly the correct answer. But the researchers who have noted the clustering of thin catalog entries around precisely this category of 19th century correspondence are asking a different question. Not whether Rome suppressed specific evidence of specific things, but whether the institutional instinct to protect the Church's public theological positions created a pattern of filing and cataloging that made certain categories of report functionally invisible to later researchers, even researchers with legitimate access to the archive. I want to ask you something directly here. When you think about an institution managing information not through dramatic censorship, but through the quieter mechanism of classification and catalog structure, does that feel more or less troubling than an outright deletion? Leave your answer in the comments. I read them, and this question matters for where we are going next. 4. There is a figure who stands at the center of the story of 19th century Vatican archival access, and he is worth spending time with because understanding his position clarifies almost everything else. Cardinal Joseph Hergenrother was a church historian from Würzburg, Germany, appointed by Pope Leo XIII in 1879 to serve as the first cardinal archivist of the Vatican secret archives. His appointment was a calculated move, and the Catholic Culture Library's review of the archive's history frames it with unusual directness. Leo XIII believed that liberal and Protestant scholars had been falsifying history to embarrass the Church. He brought Hergenrother to Rome specifically to open the archive on the Church's own terms, to use access as a weapon of counter-narrative. The argument was that if you showed scholars what was actually there, if you guided them through the material under controlled conditions, you could demonstrate that the worst accusations against the Church were unfounded. And in at least one early case, that strategy worked. In April of 1883, the German Protestant historian Theodor von Sickel used documents from the newly opened archive to defend the Church against charges of forgery. Leo XIII was reportedly pleased. The archive opened more fully to international scholarship as a result. But the conditions under which that openness operated are the part that gets less attention, and they are crucial to understanding the 19th century paradox. Hergenrother wrote a memo to Leo XIII recommending access. What the memo also reflected, according to the framing in the Catholic Culture Review, was the concern that Protestant researchers in particular might use their access to slander or embarrass the Church. Access was designed from the beginning to be guided access. Researchers received what they requested, provided they could specify it precisely. They worked in a reading room under supervision. The archive's own finding aids were not handed over. Researchers were expected to know what they were looking for before they arrived, which created an immediate structural advantage for the institution over the researcher. You cannot find what you do not know to look for. And you cannot know to look for something if the catalog that would tell you it exists is itself part of the archive. In 1883, within 2 years of the formal opening, the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, which handled the most politically sensitive correspondence of the Holy See, began a process of reviewing the 19th century files under its jurisdiction. The nature and outcome of that review is not publicly documented in a way that researchers have been able to fully trace. What is documented in administrative records from the period that scholars have examined is that the classification structure for certain categories of 19th century correspondence was reorganized during this period. Documents were refiled under new designations. Old registers were updated. And when researchers in the decades following that reorganization attempted to follow citation trails that appeared in earlier finding aids, some of those trails ended at folder designations that no longer corresponded to anything in the updated catalog. This is not a smoking gun. It is genuinely possible that the reorganization was purely administrative, a belated attempt to impose consistency on a collection that had been chaotically disrupted by the Napoleonic transfer and imperfectly restored. That explanation deserves to be taken seriously. But there is a pattern here that the record at minimum permits us to note without overstatement. The reorganization happened almost immediately after access was opened. It affected the classification of correspondence that was already among the most politically sensitive the archive held. And it created the kind of gaps in the catalog that would be most damaging to researchers working on questions about what Rome knew and when it knew it. Whether that pattern reflects deliberate management or institutional coincidence is something the available evidence cannot definitively resolve. What does not add up is the timing. Why reorganize the sensitive categories within 2 years of opening, when the institution had been accumulating these documents for decades without apparent urgency to reclassify them? There is one more dimension to Hergenrother's position that the standard account tends to pass over, and it connects directly to what we are heading toward next. Hergenrother was a prolific scholar in his own right, not merely an administrator. His multi-volume history of the Church, published before his appointment to Rome, was regarded as one of the most serious works of Catholic historiography produced anywhere in the 19th century. He understood archives from the inside, not as a bureaucrat, but as a working researcher. He understood what finding aids communicated, and equally, what they concealed through omission. When he recommended opening access to researchers, he was not making a naive gesture toward institutional transparency. He was making a calculated move, executed by a man who understood precisely how a major research archive can be opened in ways that feel generous while the real navigational control stays exactly where it has always been, inside the institution's own catalog structure. Whether he shaped that catalog deliberately, whether what happened to the classification of certain correspondence categories in the early 1880s was an intentional decision, or the ordinary byproduct of a large bureaucratic reorganization, is something the available evidence cannot settle. The record is genuinely unclear on this specific point. But Hergenrother was both a sophisticated archivist and a committed defender of the Church's historical narrative, and the reorganization of the most sensitive classification series happened under his watch and within his first 2 years in the role. That is a fact the record does support, and it is a fact worth sitting with before we move on. And now, because every time the record clears slightly, another door appears at the edge of the frame, I need to tell you about the document. Not the kind of single sensational document that conspiracy literature loves to build entire architectures around. Something more complicated and more interesting than that. Something that appears not in one place but in many places, always referenced, never produced, always described slightly differently, depending on who is doing the referencing. The thing about the 19th century Vatican is that it was not a sealed world. The Church's business touched virtually every major institution of the era, and the private correspondence of bishops, scholars, Vatican officials, and connected laypeople is scattered across dozens of archives on multiple continents. University collections, private family papers, diocesan archives, the records of religious orders, the personal journals of scholars who spent time in Rome during the last decades of the 1800s. Taken individually, each of these sources tells a partial story. Taken together, they create a landscape of reference that is more interesting than any single item within it. What researchers in several different archival traditions have noted, in published work as well as in the quieter channels of academic correspondence, is the recurring appearance of a reference to a document from the mid-19th century that circulated briefly or was known to have existed briefly among a small number of senior ecclesiastical figures before disappearing from the accessible record. The document is described in these references in terms that are consistent enough to suggest they are pointing at the same thing, but inconsistent enough in their specifics to make positive identification impossible. Some references describe it as a compiled report, a consolidation of missionary correspondence from multiple continents, covering a period of roughly 2 decades in the middle of the 1800s. Others describe it as a single letter, very long, addressed from a specific apostolic delegate to the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. Some reference it as being in Latin, some suggest it was in Italian. The content in every description that gets specific enough to be useful involves physical findings, material evidence of human presence or activity at locations, and in forms that posed a direct challenge to the accepted chronology of human civilizational development as the Church itself understood and publicly defended that chronology. I want to be careful here and transparent about the evidentiary chain I am working with. This document has not been produced. It has not been examined by any researcher whose examination has been published in a verifiable form. What exists is the pattern of reference to it, and that pattern is real, traceable, and carries its own weight of implication. A private diary entry from a scholar who spent time in Rome in the 1880s, currently held in a university archive in Germany, mentions a conversation with a junior Vatican official who described having seen, briefly and without authorization, a bound report of missionary findings that had been marked for restricted access and removed from the general correspondence files. The diary does not name the document. It describes its content in general terms that align with the pattern in other references. The scholar notes that the official declined to say anything more specific and seemed, in the diarist's words, uncomfortable having mentioned it at all. A letter from a Belgian bishop written in the 1890s, preserved in a diocesan archive, references in passing a document that had been circulating among missionary administrators before being, as the bishop phrases it, recalled to Rome. He does not elaborate. He moves on to other business. A marginal note in a published scholarly work from the first decade of the 20th century, handwritten by a researcher whose identity can be established from the library ownership stamp, refers to a primary source that the note's author describes as having been unable to locate through normal channels, despite 2 separate attempts to request it through the Vatican catalog system. The notation in the margin describes the source's subject matter in terms that are recognizable as belonging to the same cluster of references. None of this constitutes proof of anything. I want to be honest about that limitation. What it constitutes is a pattern of people in different countries, in different decades, in different institutional contexts, referencing what sounds like the same piece of material. A piece of material that none of them were able to produce, that none of them seem to have examined directly, and that does not appear in any publicly accessible catalog under any of the descriptions attributed to it. The most cautious reading of this pattern is that the document, if it existed at all, was simply one of the many pieces of correspondence that did not survive the Napoleonic disruption or the subsequent reorganizations in a form that can be located today. That is possible. It is even likely, statistically, given how much material was genuinely lost. But the post-1881 references, the ones that come from scholars and officials who were working after the archive reopened, suggest that at least some of the people making these references believed the document still existed and was simply not accessible. That is a different kind of gap from loss. That is something that sounds more like deliberate unavailability. And if that is even partially true, it raises the question that I find hardest to set aside. What would a mid-19th century consolidated missionary report need to contain about physical findings in the field to warrant the kind of handling that the surrounding references suggest it received? 6. I want to bring all of this into focus in a way that is honest about what we know, what we can reasonably infer, and what remains genuinely open. Because the Vatican archive story is not a story about one secret. It is a story about a system, and systems are more revealing and more troubling than individual secrets in the long run, because systems persist. Here is what the record actually supports. The Vatican Apostolic Archive holds approximately 85 kilometers of shelving, a figure confirmed by the Vatican News website and by multiple independent archival studies. It houses documents covering roughly 12 centuries of history. Access to it is controlled in ways that are architecturally different from most major research archives. The finding aids themselves are not public. Documents must be requested by specific designation, and the catalog that would allow a researcher to build that specific designation is only accessible from inside the research process. This is not unusual in the world of restricted archives, but it creates a structural situation where the institution controls not just the material, but the map to the material. And in the 19th century holdings particularly, where the catalog is thinnest and the cross-referencing most inconsistent, that structural control has the practical effect of making certain categories of material navigable only to researchers who already know approximately what they are looking for and who have developed over years of access and informal working knowledge of how the catalog works around its own gaps. Here is what the record suggests but cannot confirm. The reorganization of the classification system for politically sensitive 19th century correspondence in the early 1880s, conducted almost immediately after the archive opened to scholarship, created a layer of navigational friction that disproportionately affects research into missionary field reports and related correspondence from the middle decades of the 1800s. Whether this friction was deliberately engineered or is the residue of institutional chaos is genuinely unclear from the available evidence. Both explanations are possible. The combination of them, some deliberate management layered over genuine disorder, is perhaps the most historically plausible reading. Here is what remains open, and may remain open. The document that circulates through the private papers and correspondence of 19th century and early 20th century scholars as a recurring but unproduced reference may be a real piece of material that is currently unavailable through the archive's public systems. It may be something that was lost in the Napoleonic disruption or a subsequent organizational overhaul. It may be a composite of several different documents that researchers over the decades conflated into a single reference through the normal processes of rumor and imprecise transmission. The pattern of reference is real. What it points at is not provable from outside the institution. But let me offer you the frame that I think deserves the most serious consideration, because I think the story of the 19th century Vatican archives is ultimately a story about something more universal than church politics or institutional secrecy. It is a story about how an institution that becomes the primary custodian of a category of information simultaneously becomes the primary authority on what that information means. The church in the 19th century was not simply receiving reports from the field. It was the institution through which those reports were filtered, classified, and potentially preserved or lost. When a bishop in Central Africa wrote to Rome about structural remains he had encountered that did not fit his understanding of local human history, the letter he sent did not enter a neutral repository. It entered an institution with extremely strong institutional interests in how questions about the age and development of human civilization were answered. And within that institution, the people making decisions about how to file, classify, and catalog incoming correspondence were the same people managing the Church's public theological positions on exactly those questions. That does not mean they were systematically destroying evidence. It means they were human beings inside an institution, making practical decisions under institutional pressure, and that those decisions, accumulated over decades, produced a pattern in the archive that later researchers encounter as a set of gaps, thin entries, and broken citation trails. The monument to that pattern is not a single locked door or a single missing document. It is the aggregate effect of 1,000 small filing decisions made by people who believed, probably sincerely, that they were protecting something worth protecting. And what makes this matter beyond the Vatican specifically is that every institution that becomes the custodian of its own historical record faces the same temptation, the same set of small decisions, the same slow accumulation of protective classification that eventually becomes, from the outside, indistinguishable from systematic concealment. If you have been part of the Epoch Reset community for a while, you already know that this is the kind of question we do not leave sitting in the abstract. So here is where I want the conversation to go, and I am serious about this. The comment section on this video is going to be the place where some of the most interesting follow-up threads develop. If you have worked with archival material from this period, if you have come across references in your own reading that fit the pattern we have been tracing, if you have a framework for thinking about institutional memory and its management that gives you a different reading of what the evidence suggests, I want to hear it. Leave it in the comments. The conversation that happens there is genuinely part of how this investigation continues, because no single researcher, no single episode, no single archive visit is going to crack this open alone. Now, before I let you go, there is one more thread that I have been holding back because it connects the 19th century Vatican story to something much larger, something that points forward rather than backward, and it starts with a question about what happened to the archive during one specific decade of the 1800s when a particular category of incoming correspondence appears, based on the catalog structure, to have been handled differently from the surrounding material. Not dramatically differently. Subtly. The kind of difference that you would not notice unless you were comparing catalog entry density across the entire run of a particular correspondence series and had reason to believe the variation was not random. Researchers who have done exactly that comparison and published their methodology in academic form have noted that the decade in question is the 1850s to the 1860s, the period immediately following the most dramatic expansion of church missionary activity in the Southern Hemisphere and in territories of Central Africa. And the category of correspondence where the catalog gets thinnest during exactly those years is the incoming reports from the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, covering apostolic delegate activity in territories that were, at the time, among the least known parts of the planet to European science. What was being found there? What was being seen by men who were among the most educated observers their civilization produced, writing back to Rome with a detail and a seriousness that their institution would ultimately decide needed to be handled with particular care? That question does not close tonight. But I can tell you that the next investigation we run on this channel is going to go directly into the field reports themselves, the ones that did make it into published missionary literature, and measure the distance between what those publications described and what the underlying correspondence, where it has been located and examined, actually contained. And that distance, in the cases where we can measure it, is wider than you would expect from simple editorial compression. Much wider. Wide enough to make you wonder what the full account looked like before it was made fit for publication. If you are not subscribed to Epoch Reset, do it right now, and here is why this specific moment matters. What we are building toward over the next several episodes is a connected investigation. Each piece fits into the next. If you come in halfway through, you will be missing the context that makes the later findings land with their full weight. Subscribe and hit the notification so you are there from the beginning of each new thread. This is not a channel where you can skim the highlights and feel like you have gotten the picture. The picture only emerges when you follow the whole thing. The Vatican Apostolic Archive holds 85 kilometers of shelving, 12 centuries of documents. 3,239 crates went to Paris, and between a quarter and a third of them never came back. The catalog that would let you navigate what remains is not public. The finding aids are accessible only from inside the system. And in the 19th century holdings, where the archive was simultaneously at its most politically pressured, its most informationally active, and its most recently disrupted, the catalog is thinnest in exactly the categories where the most unusual reports were arriving from the most remote corners of a world that European institutions were only beginning to systematically document. What is the simplest explanation for all of that? And does the simplest explanation actually satisfy you? Or does this feel like something that was, if not buried exactly, then arranged in ways that made it very hard to find by people who understood, in the way that institutions always understand these things before any individual voice articulates the policy, that some categories of information are better left navigable only to those who already know what they are navigating toward? Tell me what you think. I mean that. The comment thread on this video is going to be where the next part of this investigation actually begins. And I will be reading every one of them. This is Elliot Carter. This is Epoch Reset. And the archive is still open if you know what to ask for.